Before you know it, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days.
Hi, I'm Bella, and you can see my YouTube channel at SpideyGirls/Bella. You are listening to WNAH LP 103.5 FM, New Haven, streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, follow, and yeah.
Hello and welcome to WNHH Radio's Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. Shana Kendall and Steve Ham make New Haven tick. Shana is a sergeant in the police department. She's part of a new documentary and panel discussion on the scheduled Thursday night at the New Haven Documentary Film Festival. Steve is a journalist and filmmaker who's been hanging out with New Haven cops and has his own resulting documentary and panel discussion scheduled for next week in the festival. And Aaron Perano Garrison, who made the film in which Shana stars, is also with us here in the WNHH studio. They're going to talk about these projects and about the policing issues facing our community today. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming in.
Nice to see you.
What an honor to have the star-studded cast at the beginning of the documentary festival.
Look at that.
And we're going to also thanks to Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. So opening night of the festival Thursday in the auditorium of the Whitney's Humanities Center, 53 Wall Street, we're going to have The Sweetest Land, Hartford Cops, a 63-minute minute movie, and then a panel discussion, and then Questions of Justice, Officers of Color in the Era of Black Lives Matter. Shana, you're the photo on that film.
Yes, I am.
And how did that happen, Aaron? Is she the main character or what?
Shana actually came a little later to the project, but it was Shana who we immediately knew would make the film work. Not everybody has the ability to just be themselves in front of a camera, but Shana's done a lot of work in front of people, and she's quite comfortable in that way, and had a very personal story to tell. It just seemed like it made sense.
And Aaron, I'm going to ask you to get close, if you don't mind. And, Steve's been hanging out at Comstat, riding around with the cops. Shane has been a cop riding around as the cops. And it's kind of is it a coincidence, do you think, Steve and Shane and Aaron, that as we have this big, amazing documentary festival starting for 2 weeks almost in New Haven, Michael Moore is going to be here. They're showing all his movies. There's so many interesting movies happening, so many panel discussions like yours. Do you think it's a coincidence that we have two films in which New Haven police play at least a starring, and in one case the entire role, and that they're both in the context of Black Lives Matter? Steve, does that surprise you that you'd end up bumping into these guys in the same thing, same kind of movie?
Well, it doesn't surprise me that this is a topic for documentaries because, for the past couple of years, it's just been top of mind in, one of the big issues in the country between Black Lives Matter and, like the Trump approach to everything. It's like there's
the Trump approach to everything. I kind of
there's a collision.
Is that a hashtag?
Yeah.
So there's a collision, you're saying, between two visions of the way policing should work. The question is being called, and you two both have documentaries about how it's working out on the street.
Right.
All right. So Shana, how did you get involved with the project?
So actually, when Dave Hartman was at the police department, I believe that he
was the public information officer.
Correct. He had Aaron reached out to the police department
many times.
Yeah, and I was asked based on what brought me to the police department and my story and relationship with the city of New Haven, he felt like I would be the best person to participate in this
Well,
documentary.
you do have, as we know, and as readers of The Independent know, you have a very compelling story. I mean, the tragic shooting deaths of first your brother and then your cousin.
Yes.
And you told me once that you saw the police doing their job when they came to investigate at least one of those crimes, and you thought, I want to be a cop like that.
Correct.
That's not your everyday reaction to someone growing up in New Haven. Why was it Shayna Kendall's reaction?
Yeah. So actually, it was the detectives at the time. One of them was retired Sergeant Steve Teague, and the relationship that he and his partner had with my family was remotely close to my brother being part of their family. It wasn't as though they were a detective working the case. It was more so that they were trying to assist in the apprehension of the person who committed this offense to their own brother or their own uncle or their own, relative.
So you saw what a cop could be.
Correct.
And how long was that? About 15 years ago,
Yes.
Shayna?
Yep.
So you were how old at the time?
Okay, so you want me to put my age over the air? I was pretty young.
You were at an impressionable age.
Correct.
An age where a lot of people, as I bet your documentaries talk about, do not have such positive impressions of the police. Why do you think it was different in your case?
I believe it was because of their ability to connect. They were very familiar with the area. The job that they had in speaking with them afterwards was not so much their job. It was the ability to connect with the people that they essentially serve. It wasn't, I am Detective so-and-so and this is what I'm here to do. It was, answering phone calls at 2:00 in the morning when my mom just wanted to talk about nothing that had to do with my brother, but just, a source of comfort in knowing that they allowed themselves to be there. I think that it's, you have to want to be that individual, whether it's now or it was then, and you have to be able to be, indebted into the community. And I think that's what they had. And it showed in, the manner in which they
Which is
treated
different from a traditional definition of policing where you catch crooks and you catch them by just going after the bad guys. And you're not a social worker. You're not, doing things other people society. And Steve, we heard that phrase community policing, which there was a version of it hatched in New Haven in the 90s. We're revisiting now what it means. When you hear Shayna talk, is that what you see happening in New Haven? Is that the thrust of your film?
Well, I think that's the strategic and philosophical core of community policing. The idea that people are relating to others as human beings and treating them with respect and working for them as a service, as they would work for their own relatives. So I think that's kind of an ideal. There are many different kind of elements, just strategic and technical, that kind of go into, well, how do you practice it? But I think that's absolutely
and being
important.
tied to the community and being part of the community, knowing the community. And Aaron, when you were you decided to do a film, Aaron, on color line in policing. What brought you to New Haven that when you're hearing us talk now about why Shayna became a cop, what Steve was looking at, because Steve used to cover the cops for the New Haven Register years ago, and now he came back as a documentarian after going some other places in between, developing some other chops that he brought into play here. Why New Haven? How's that fit into your story?
Well, New Haven has been home for me since around 2000, long enough that I feel a part of the community. And I've lived in different parts of the city. My sister lives over closer to the hill, and I spent some time in East Rock, and then I've spent time in Fairhaven. I owned a house in Fairhaven.
What street?
I was on Downing Street.
I spent Lombard. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and so I've done ride-alongs in Fairhaven with Shayna, and so it made sense. But I was also studying at Yale at the time, and I entered Yale at a time when Peter Salvoy entered or invited students to enter a difficult conversation.
You started as what kind of student at Yale?
As an undergrad.
Later in life.
Yeah, 37 I started studying.
Wow.
Yeah. So I wanted to enter that conversation. Initially, I thought I would do something on the college. And that quickly changed, but it still remained within the same scope of the conversation I wanted to have. And being a person who has spent years of my life in the South, I also wanted to be faced with difficult questions as well for myself. And, what better way to do that than to use the thing that I was studying to as a mechanism to kind of like confront my own.
And we're talking about policing with some folks who have some new documentaries out that you're going to be able to see and talk about in the coming week at the New Haven Docs Festival, where Steve Ham with Shana Kendall and Aaron Perano Garrison. So Shana, one of the parts of community policing when we started in the 90s, and which we struggled to still do, which is to hire people who know the community and reflect the community. So you're an African-American woman.
Yes.
And when they started community policing, there weren't many women.
Correct.
And there weren't many African-Americans.
Correct. How
does that fit in? When you came to the department, did you find that it was a department that embraced African-American women? Did you find that that was an important part of community policing? Did you find that there were obstacles to overcome because you were an African-American woman?
I think that I'm not sure if the obstacles were related to me being an African-American woman opposed to me just being a woman. And I think some of those obstacles were not so much really visible. They weren't up front in my face, unless it was just more so more like an overwhelming sense of protection, perhaps because of the thought that I was incapable of handling matters on my own. With that,
is that true?
Is that no? I'm I'm fully capable. With that, I believe that for me, I was taking on a different approach with the understanding that our mouth is the best tool that we have. Obviously, we walk around with a lot of gear on, but essentially it boils down to the way we communicate with people. And I think for me, because I still have family that live in New Haven, I grew up in New Haven, I am a representative of how I want people to treat those who are close to me, which is why I feel like in the realm of community policing, I'm not sure that you could necessarily teach that. It has to be something within yourself. And if you have compassion and you're committed to getting to know the people in your neighborhood, and you take a responsibility that it's more of an investigation of this is just another complainant, or this is just another task that I have to handle in the course of my duties, as opposed to a willingness and wanting to come to a resolution. Even checking on a person afterwards has to be,
We talked about 2 a.m. with Detective Teague.
Correct.
So now you've been fast in the department. So you started out patrolling, then you were a detective.
Correct.
And you did some of those sensitive family cases,
yes,
child abuse, things like that. Now you're overseeing patrol. You're a patrol sergeant, and in the B shift, you said before we went in the air, you're back in Dixwell and New Hallville.
Yes.
Where you still have family.
Yes.
And so did you ever can you tell me about a moment where you said, you just talked a moment ago about taking those late night phone calls. Can you tell me about a day or an evening where you said, oh, this was sort of what I was thinking when I watched Detective Teague working years ago?
Yeah, so absolutely. More so when I was a detective, because, you're dealing with, at the time I was assigned to Special Victims Unit. So when kids would ask me, so what do you do? It's like, I'm the real life Olivia. That's exactly what I did. So, parents would call all the time when they had, their children who were going through traumatic situations after an interview, and they learned exactly what happened to their child. My phone would be on all times of the night. And I remember distinctly there was a young lady who she learned that her son was being sexually abused. She called me at 4:32 in the morning, and I spoke to her until it was time for me to be at work at 8 o'clock that morning. And it was things that didn't really have much to do with what was going on with her son. They were kind of going from baseball games to a sister of hers getting married, to what's going to happen with her son, to my line of work and what do I do and what she has to look forward to. And sometimes it takes just being there to listen, just to let someone know that you're there listening to them and you hear their concerns and things that they're saying. Since I've been a supervisor, I've had those similar experience, and they were based on my relationships and people knowing me from the community. There are times where I have had to say, if it's an emergency, like, do call 911. I'm not like a 24/7, I'm not working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And those calls are the same. I guide and I direct them where they need to be. And sometimes I'm even going there as their source of comfort when speaking to other police officers, just to have me there, knowing that they know me, kind of helps that relationship
So they know
building
you
also.
because you're from the community. We've had
Correct.
so much upheaval in who runs what departments.
Mm-hmm.
If you go on the website, usually it's it can be as many as 3 district managers behind and who they list as running a district in New Haven.
Mm-hmm.
Has that limited the ability of community policing to take hold? Do people really know they know you? Do they know your cops?
So for instance, I covered downtown Dixwell Avenue in New Hallville. So most often those cops are responding to those addresses in those areas. So they are familiar with them because when they call for need and those cops are working, those same cops are arriving. The same primary investigators and their backups are the same that are arriving. Whether or not they have built those relationships, if they're repeat callers, they have. Even if they don't call so frequently, I believe that the officers do their best to basically communicate that they are there if needed.
And Steve, this is a fundamental part of community policing you were looking into. Is that how you're seeing it?
Well, actually, if I might, I have a question for Shana. How do we recruit more people like you for the New Haven Police Department? Because I think you're the model. We need lots of you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you replicate for us or something? Or no?
So I think that recruitment efforts have to come from those who can speak on the topic. Unfortunately, I'm not too sure that often is the case. And I think that we have to be able to be okay with opening up about where we come from in those recruiting efforts. Obviously, there is the want to get people, especially now our department is down many cops. But it's very important for quality sometimes as opposed to quantity. And I think that those who are recruiting have to be a reflection of who you want to recruit.
So they're not necessarily from New Haven, but they have to have the capacity to have empathy and care.
Correct.
For the people of the neighborhood.
Correct.
Stephen, so when you started making this documentary, I guess it was the 80s you covered the police, right?
I was here in the kind of mid-'80s, and I was here for crack, lots of shootings, and I was also here for HIV.
So it was before the beginning community policing under Nick Costa.
Yeah.
So now you came back years later.
Yeah.
And you're doing a film where we have this reputation of being a great community policing department. In fact, police are not now shooting people in the streets. We're having different kinds of arguments here. We're not having arguments about what used to happen with the beat down posse. But when you hear Shana and I talk about the efforts to have relationships in the community, I brought up how much of a shift there is and who's running each department. What did you find? What did you expect to find about the state of community policing, and what did you find when you did your film?
Well, my conclusion from about a year and a half of really looking at it was that it's practiced earnestly, but far from perfectly. And I think there are a lot of believers in the command staff, especially when Campbell was here. I don't, and he's a true believer. And I felt I met a lot of people who were believers from top to bottom of the department. And part of it was probably because I was channeled to those people. I mean, I was exploring, well, what is it kind of at its best? So I talked to a lot of people who were really good performers from top to bottom of the department. I talked to some very young officers, overnight shift in Fairhaven, and Eduardo Leonardo was one, and there's some others. And, these guys are in maybe their early to mid 20s, and they showed just incredible maturity in the way they dealt with people and in their view, their composure under stressful situations. I mean, for instance, when the bars, and Van Dome and the other bars over there let out, a police officer has to be kind of expert at 5 different things at once.
Right.
And I was just so impressed by that. On the other hand, I talked to enough people that feel like they aren't respected. People in the community not respected. You know, the approach, the language that's used and stuff like that. So we know that that's an element. And then another element is that there are still kind of repeat offenders in the department, a handful or a few or whatever, who've just again and again used excessive force or shown disrespect. And the difficulty of getting those people out has got to be a tremendous frustration for the command staff and also for all these good police officers who are doing a good job. They're really providing a service. They got these other people that they're kind of like saddled with. This is my view. So that's ultimately my takeaway. I feel like now the discussion has to be what new or different things can we do? And recruiting seems like one very important area, really being very thoughtful about that. And I really liked your comment about it's not quantity, it's quality. And you do have to handle those 911 calls, but beyond that, even, people respond to those, that's got to be a certain quality person.
Right.
And when you talk about quantity and quality, I was interested when Shana said that too, because one of the debates going on now is what does community policing look like? A lot of people say it's the walk and beat. That's labor intensive. We're down from we had 495 budgeted positions. We're under 400 cops. You can't have everyone walking around. But some fundamental tenets of community policing, no matter how you see the details, include seeing small problems before they get to be bigger problems, getting relationships so you know people in the community, working with other people who work on issues, whether it's social workers, probation, community leaders, management teams, just walking the beat. So Shana, how important, some people are saying we can pay cops more by having fewer cops, have good cops, train them right. They don't have to be walking the beat all the time. Do you agree with that?
I do agree, and the reason why I agree with that is because you can place 2 cops in anywhere in the city, and they could walk. That's all they could do is walk. If they aren't getting to know, Miss Susan and her grandchildren on the corner, or they don't know that, young kids are hanging in the back of this cut through that leads to the other residents on the other street. If they don't know those things, or they aren't trying to understand and figure those things out and build those relationships, then that's essentially all you have is 2 police officers walking a beat. With that, if you're in a car and officers aren't responding to a call, officers can still park their car and walk the
That's
beat.
John Valeca's point. He's a retired associate. He said that if you have a cop who likes to get to know people, they might be walking beat. They'll be hiding out somewhere and making phone calls. If you have a cop who likes to know people, they'll drive around and look at out of the car and they'll walk sometimes.
Correct. Right. I agree.
All right. And so we're talking about policing, which is in New Haven policing, subject to 2 new documentaries being shown this week over the next week at the New Haven Documentary Film Festival, which is going to be outrageously good. And the 2 we're talking about today are going to have panels with them. Thursday night, Questions of Justice, Office of Color in the Era of Black Lives Matter, and Steve Ham's one coming up next week. Steve, the title again is Shift Change.
Yes.
All right.
Shift Change, Community Policing in New Haven. It's on June 4th, 6:30 p.m. And you will lead the panel afterwards.
So we're taking no prisoners.
Hopefully you have that on your schedule.
We're having it on my schedule. You don't have to worry about that.
Okay, great.
Aaron Perano Garasini, the director of Officers of Color, Questions of Justice. You focused in on the race issue. Why did you focus in right now on the issue of race and policing, or what did you find out?
It's easy for someone like me to dismiss policing. To sort of say, oh, these people are paid to, watch our communities. If I'm stopped by a police officer, there's inevitably going to be nothing that's going to happen. I don't tend to break the law in any major way, and so when I'm stopped, it's a very quick conversation, usually no ticket at all. And that's not necessarily what people of color are going to face whenever they're stopped by a police officer. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We're talking about community policing, and it is easily sort of defined in the more traditional way as this sort of like being in the community, walking beats, because officers need to build those relationships. But in fact, 80% of interactions with police officers happen within a car. So, that's going to be where your community policing is going to need to take place, because 20% of the time isn't going to cover community policing. And it's going to be important. You mentioned Anthony being a big believer, but I think Anthony believed in the potential of a city that embraces a police force where people in those communities can expect to see proportionately people that look like them, people that feel as though they belong to the community, that they understand the community. And I think that's a big part of the reason why, Shayna has such a, is at ease with these community
Now, I've
members.
seen Sheena at ease on the east side, which had much more of a white population, working class white to middle class white. I remember you were involved in that whole time when you were working out with Officer Gangano how to not have dirt bike problems, because a lot of the dirt bikers come from the east side and they like to cause havoc on the streets. You found a way for them to race with permission on some blocked off streets. Did race come into factor there? I mean, there is racism on that. There's racism here in America, but on the east side is where people do vote for Donald Trump, and they used to burn, in our collective memory, they were burning houses where there's public housing coming in. So how did race come into play there when you were in charge?
I'm not sure that it was necessarily race as opposed to just finding like a happy medium on their desire to do this and our ability to allow them to do that in a safe and controlled environment. Unfortunately, most of the time, you can't necessarily stop people when they want to do something. That's just the reality. But if we come to a happy medium and we figure out, where we both can meet, whether it's time constraints, whether it's allowing things to occur in a certain area and having police be a part of it, where we control how it plays out, but still allowing the ability for people to enjoy things that they would like to enjoy. I think that's where that comes in.
And how's that working out? Because dirt biking continues to be a big problem in town. What you guys have done successfully there was one specific locus of it down near the Hole in the Wall Club in the annex, and you blocked off the streets behind, because part of the fun for them is to break the rules, right? So you had, at least for a while, where they were doing it out of the harm's way for other people, and you were all getting along. Did that last, and is that spreading to become part of a larger solution in town?
So no, not necessarily. And what we found also is that most of the dirt biking ATV issues that we have, they're not necessarily from our city.
Right, New London, there was a group coming
Correct. And sometimes they're transporting these ATVs and dirt bikes in the back of trucks, and they're unloading, and now they're, ripping through the city. So on our part, as much as we try, whether it's, waiting until they get gas or utilizing the community to, ascertain information as to, where they see them parking or unloading these trucks and whatnot. But most of the time they're riding around and then they're jumping back on the highway and heading back, home.
And Steve and Aaron, I want to ask you, in trying to capture, so Shana knows what it's like to be cops. It's like on the street. You guys came in as filmmakers trying to get the pulse of community policing. Tell me about one big challenge you faced in a moment when you said, boy, this is tougher than I thought. Here's what just happened. It made me wonder if I'm getting the full story. Steve, did you have a moment like that?
Well, the toughest thing about the film for me in terms of making it was that a number of people declined to be interviewed by me. And I've been a reporter for 40 years, and that's almost never happened. So it was a bit of a surprise. And it was the protesters. It was the people who protested for the CRB and other things like
Community,
this.
Civilian Review Board.
Yeah. And there were 4 people that I asked to interview, and they all either kind of said no or said yes and then didn't do it. And so that was a disappointment, though I did represent, I think, more than adequately represented their point of view.
Well, you went to the hearings, you went to the protests, you heard what they had to say.
Yeah, they spoke publicly, so their points of view were well represented. And also I did speak to other community activists who just weren't core members of that group, who were quite willing to talk to me and spoke eloquently.
And in your movie, we drive around with people in the television division, the beat cops. I mean, I really enjoyed watching that movie. I learned a lot from it, Steve. Tell me about the one moment you had in making the film. You said, ooh, this is a good one. This is a moment I got. This has helped me see what's going on. This is the story I want to tell.
Well, it has to do with dirt bikers. So I used to.
It all has to do with dirt bikers.
Yeah. So I did 1/3 of the film was all in Fairhaven. And I used to go, and I wanted to represent Fairhaven in all of its kind of flavors. And in fact, in my film, there's a lot of stuff that's not about police at all. It's about community. So I used to go on weekends. I would just ride my bike into Fairhaven with my camera strapped around my over.
And you
my
live
shoulder.
very near, because you're.
I live in the next neighborhood over, and so I would go in, and dirt bikers had to be part of it, because in Fairhaven, by Criscola Park and along the Grand Avenue, it's a big deal. and people are injured, stuff like that. So it's a big deal. And the cops told me this is one of our biggest problems.
Mm-hmm.
So I went after it. And one day I rode through, and there was nobody in Criscola Park when I rode through. But then I heard the roar of engines behind me, and I turned back, and there were about 24 guys along James Street. And it was a funny day because I was wearing my sunglasses, so I wasn't wearing my prescription glasses, so I really couldn't see that well. And I was talking to some of these guys at one end, and they were doing tricks for me and stuff like that because I engaged with them. But at the other end, there were a bunch of guys who were at a food truck, and they had taken their masks off. And I didn't see it through my lens because I couldn't see that well. But they were giving me the finger and waving me off and all this kind of stuff. And I didn't perceive how hostile they were to me, and I actually moved closer to them. And they surrounded me and started pushing on me and shoving on me. They wanted to grab my camera. They wanted to take
These were the dirt bikers?
Yeah, they wanted to take my camera, and I had it under my arm, and I had my bike in my other hand. So I realized I had to give up one item. So I gave up my bike, and I ran through them like a football player, and got to a safe spot where there were a bunch of adults. But they beat the hell out of my bike, I got to tell you.
Did you ever get the bike back?
I got it back, but it was bent up.
Like, where did you find it later?
Oh, it was wheeled to me by some other people in the park.
Boy, what a story! Did you think of calling the police and your community policing cops?
I didn't think of calling the police, but
you were doing a documentary about policing, and you were the victim of a crime.
Yeah, but I got some really good shots that day, and I did turn my raw video over to Carl Jacobson,
who's the head of intelligence,
and I have no idea if it was useful to him, but it might have been. Who knows?
So, Aaron Perano Garrison, can you top that? When you made this movie, what was a moment where you said you had a challenge to really capture what's going on? That's a great story, Steve.
Yeah, I get the advantage of sitting here thinking about it, and honestly, I had something else in mind. I'll start that way. Part of the thing here is I'm a white guy who wanted to interview African American police officers, but not necessarily just African American police officers, people of color. And that's not something I felt I could do alone. So I co-directed with a young man, Clark Burnett, who's a sociology major. So he was African American and had a deep engagement with these issues as well. And I didn't just once, but repeatedly was sort of running up against my privilege. So what I might think of as a good idea would get shot down by Clark.
Give me an example.
There are so many that ultimately what it comes down to is sensitivity. What sounds like something a person can hear coming from a person of privilege is in fact something that will shut people down off.
But you can't think of an example of that?
Not at the moment.
And what about a moment?
I'm clouded by a moment that came up.
Tell me about that.
And actually, this is a moment of sort of me being misguided as a person, right? This could have happened to anybody. We rented this. We were going to Baltimore, and I rented an Airbnb. And I kid you not, the Airbnb belonged to a woman whose boss I was interviewing the next day.
Oh,
I didn't find this out until after we had rented the place.
What a coincidence.
Yeah. So we kind of got there, and I felt this sort of like connection to this woman who wouldn't let us interview her. She worked with a senator as well and was splitting her time between the police department and the senator. And she said, well, I can't talk. But what she did say was, you need to go down to Freddie Gray's neighborhood. You need to experience the neighborhood, and you guys really can't leave until you go down there. So we had initially decided we would not do that going into Baltimore. We were there to interview the deputy chief of police, and we were invited there by a sergeant from the Arlington Police Department, and this wasn't something you could just walk into. But we thought, well, we'll go down there, we'll have the camera, we'll film architecture, we won't film people. And we ended up on a quarter. She wanted us to go down in the morning at a certain hour whenever there's a lot of open peddling of drugs. And we ended up at this corner, and Clark lowering his camera as we approached the corner where a whole group of people were selling drugs in ski masks. One guy did not have a ski mask, and that's the guy who approached our car. So I didn't know from the moment the guy started walking towards the car whether he saw a camera or a gun or what would be worse. And the guy tried to sell drugs to us, but he knew we weren't there for drugs, and it was pretty hairy.
So what happened?
He actually, we tried to decline, and he pivoted on his foot, and he says to the guys on the corner, "Flip this," and I got a gun. And I didn't know when it came out of his mouth if he meant he had a gun, which I assumed he did, or if he believed we had a gun. And I said, "Clark, just take a deep breath." And we were at a red light. So I waited and slowly eased into the intersection, and we moved on. And I just felt like a complete idiot because Clark was like 19 and I was in my 40s, and we had kind of agreed to this. And I felt like it was a moment where I got too excited about making the film and lost sight of what we were, there to do.
How about a moment where it worked, where it clicked? And you said, "This is why I made the film. I got something that really tells the story."
Yeah, I think that would easily be working with Shayna. When I could see her forgetting that we were there and just doing her job, she did exactly what she talks about. We have these great images that were so cinematic of Shayna standing in the rain talking to, a guy who was mentally unstable for quite a while.
And did you pivot so you just saw the back of the guy's head and you see Shayna full on, that kind of thing? That's what we always try to do with our photos.
We were shooting in slow motion. We were taking advantage of it because it was obvious that this was something she was very invested in. But then there were, moments where we had less control of what was being seen, that, where she was tender and just opened up. And, I knew from the moment, actually, I knew the moment that she told me what she had for breakfast.
That's always the question, right?
I was making
What's
another
she have for
film at the
breakfast?
time, and she had 8 eggs for breakfast.
8 eggs? Oh, that's part of your bodybuilding.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a part of another part of her
raw
story.
eggs?
No.
Okay.
So that was the moment that I arrived, and she already had begun to sort of like become Shayna, not just Shayna the police officer.
And Shayna stars in a new movie called Questions of Justice, Officers of Color, which is going to help kick off the New Haven Documentary Festival Thursday night at the Whitney Humanities Center. And then next week on June 4th at the same place on Wall Street, Steve Hamm is going to be showing Shift Change about the New Haven police and community policing. So Shayna, you heard them talk about what it was like to make the movie. What was it like on the other end? Is it true that you got to be yourself? And how did you feel being the subject of a movie?
How it felt being in it, like Aaron said, I kind of just forgot that I was being filmed in it until it was all put together, was when it was kind of like this aha moment, like, okay, they were really filming me doing my job and having these conversations.
Did it affect how you did it? Like, say if they weren't here, I'd be like really telling this guy to go flip it.
No, it didn't at all. And like Aaron said, there were moments where I think it clicked after I, would expose like vulnerability, where I was like, oh my gosh, you caught that on camera. I'm crying, on camera talking about certain things. But no, it wouldn't have changed anything, because let's face it, although there's not a camera in our face every single day, we're always being watched.
There are body cams.
Correct.
How does that change policing? Has it made you more accountable? Does it give you backup when you're unfairly accused? How are you seeing these?
So it has worked very well in that aspect, especially for our officers and in certain situations where I think, for most people, perception is reality. So you do have people that feel as though they were mistreated by officers, and it's very easily kind of not necessarily dismissed, but certain things that they were saying, aspects of the manner in which they were spoken to and things that were said, you pull up the officer's body camera and you realize that it's not necessarily at all how it happened. So it has been very beneficial in that area, as well as just overall. I've realized that officers aren't doing anything differently. The manner in which they would investigate, they themselves have become accustomed to the body cameras that, it goes on, and they handle the investigation as they would if it was not on.
Any scenes of you at Gold's Gym?
I'm sorry?
Any scenes of you at Gold's Gym?
Oh, no, Aaron is actually working on another documentary where he did capture some images of me at Gold's.
Because you did win the National Physique Committee East Coast Cup for bodybuilding,
I
right?
did.
Wow.
Yes.
How many hours a day do you work out there?
It's only, so when I'm getting ready for a show, it's probably like an hour and a half, but that's because half hour of it is cardiovascular training and then an hour is strength training.
And I always wondered if that was part of how you cope with some of the horrors you see on the job.
So yeah, competing is a different thing in and of itself, just because it takes so much willpower to do. It's mostly restrictive, especially in how you fuel your body and what you're limited to eating. But working out in general is just a source of relief. You know what I mean? It's the one thing that you really have true control over. And
that's so interesting, because so much of what you're dealing with policing, you don't have control over.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I remember actually trying to avoid letting bodybuilding enter into the story we were telling.
It is kind of part of Shayna's story.
It's a part of
but
her
it's not
story.
about race and policing.
Well, I think it was an interesting question. Like you referred to Shayna as being like the model for community policing, and I think that's actually very true. But there's a certain like Shayna. Part of how Shayna becomes the model is so tragic, and there's this, I mean, she's a powerful woman. It's a very decided thing that she is a powerful woman. And I don't think the fact that she's strong as a person or strong physically has much to do with her policing. And then
because you said it earlier, Shane, it's your mouth is your biggest weapon.
And
Right.
it's absolutely true. I've seen that in action. Yeah. But it's also this notion that we need a hero, right? And while doing a film on female bodybuilding can talk about that and problematize it, as soon as you let Shayna become both as a police officer and not understand the depth of where she's coming from and why she might be a great candidate for, recruiting people who don't have to have her story.
And Steve, you look like you want to jump in there.
Well, I have a story that I have to tell, or I want to tell, about a female police officer. And this is actually Rachel Kane. So Rachel, when she was on patrol and some other things, she weighs about 100 pounds, something like that. Though she was a wrestler in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And a long distance bicyclist.
Yeah. So she's really fit. So you look at her and you say, how can this little woman do the job of a police officer? What she used to do is she was very fast, and if she was chasing someone, she would jump on them, knock them down, and then hold on for dear life until her partner arrived with the muscle. And it was just an incredible vision of this person, like just holding on. And just think about that. Think about the bravery. You're going to be the first one to encounter this person. You don't know how violent or maybe deranged by something they are. And I just think about, it just made me think about the bravery of police officers. And, sometimes I think maybe the general public takes this for granted, but I think it's something that's really remarkable, and that we ask our fellow citizens, we expect this of them.
Mm-hmm.
We expect bravery of them. And sometimes we see situations where their fear overcomes their rationality or other things, and then we condemn them. But I think just stopping for a second and thinking about the bravery and the situations we put them in is an important thing for everybody to do.
As we look forward, and I'm hoping everyone gets a chance to see these films either over the next week or beyond, I want to ask you, after working on these projects, start with Steve, how you feel about the future policing. Where are we now with it? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? What's the next big challenge?
Well, I'm optimistic about New Haven in general. I think it has lots of problems, and the relationship with the police and the community and crime are some of the most significant problems it has. But But I hope that we can improve community policing. If Tony Reyes is the chief going forward, he really seems like he believes in it. He seems like a very thoughtful, steady guy who communicates well. I think all those things are important. Community policing, you really need a police leader who can speak to the community, not just to the press or the police. And I think you've got somebody in that. I mean, the goal of my film is to have a conversation that kind of goes beyond, there have been a lot of demonstrations in town, and we have some very good demonstrators in this town. We're very effective. But I think at a certain point, you got to get beyond that, and you got to get to the conversation that actually leads to changes in policy or things like that. And I actually believe that, we're not having, there's the budget thing last night. They cut 3 police officers out of the budget. There doesn't seem to be a will to pay for community policing, in my view. And I think that with all we have so many different things that are problems. Mm-hmm. But I think that carefully thinking about the police department and putting the right amount into the budget and having the right strategy with whatever you think, I think that's really important. And that's something ultimately that the alders and the police command staff have to do. So I hope they make really good decisions.
All right, Aaron, if making this movie, you more optimistic, less optimistic about policing in America?
I think I got to be optimistic because the way we chose to approach the story. I think it's a difficult time for people in minority groups to be in policing, and it's a difficult time for them to find their way to policing. And it's even a more difficult time for them to think of policing as a solution to the problem. Instead of choosing something else, like pick up a picket sign, right? That's actually a good thing to do, but how else could this be done? It was a difficult time, for me, a difficult moment when Anthony needed to step down recently. He was the first, the chief of police in New Haven. He was the first African-American police officer in the history of the department. We've only had...
What do you mean as chief?
As chief.
No, Mel Waring.
There have been people of color.
No, Mel Waring was an African-American
Was
chief.
he African-American? Yep. Okay, so I was misinformed on that. So does that make 2 in the Amistad city? That is predominantly, a minority city. And Anthony was, outspoken about that. But I do believe that we are entering a period of time where certain things are going to be heard, period.
And Shana Kendall, how are you feeling about policing now after you've been out how many years now?
It'll be 10, September 8th.
All right, you've risen fast. How are you feeling about policing in New Haven and in general?
In New Haven, so I genuinely believe that New Haven is one of the greatest police departments in the country. When I decided that I wanted to be a police officer, it was for New Haven only. It wasn't for any other city within the state of Connecticut, and the reason was because of how everything started. I think the New Haven Police Department is, as I said, one of the best. I believe in the department. I believe in the relationships that we're building with the community. Obviously, there are some, hiccups that we have, but I believe that our ability to make a transition in those are farther more successful than a detriment as far as nationally. I think that they're following suit for the New Haven Police Department.
All right. Well, what a treat it's been. The hour went fast with Shana Kendall, Aaron Pirano Garrison, and Steve Ham. Everybody got to see their movies. You got to join the conversation. And here's the first chance you can see either of them. Thursday night at 9 p.m. Check out Questions of Justice, Officers of Color in the Era of Black Lives Matter. And Shana and director Aaron will be there talking about it afterwards. That's 9 o'clock at the Whitney Humanities Center, 53 Wall Street. Same spot, Tuesday, June 4th, 6:30. Check out the viewing of Shift Change Community Policing in New Haven, The Police and the People in the Era of Trump and Black Lives Matter. We're going to have a panel discussion after. Steve's going to be involved, Stacy Spell, Chief Reyes, Barbara Fair. I think it's going to be continuing the conversation. So thanks, everyone. And go to New Haven Docs. That's the New Haven Documentary Film Festival to see about all the great films, including others on policing.
Yes.
So thanks, folks, for making the time to come on. Thanks for listening. And thanks to Yale New Haven Hospital
Yes,
for
it was a
providing
pleasure.
support for today's program. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night long here at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.